if we have a bad weather season, whether that be drought or frost or whatever it is, it means production on farms decreases or can be affected drastically. And when that happens, it then means that there's less actual produce on the market. As a result, farmers will be looking for higher prices for their produce, which means for us as chefs, we then have to pay more for the produce that we then serve to you guys. And unfortunately, that then affects the prices that you pay for food.
And when you think of some of your dishes, have you had to switch things up in order to cater for these seasons? Say a particular crop is sort of I don't know, affected by climate change, right? Due to the weather conditions, we
So,
can't grow crop X.
so it has. And to be honest, there's various things. So, like I would say last year, and here in Zim specifically, there was a bit of a drought, which then affected potato production, for example. So potatoes then became like honestly almost double the price that you'd normally pay. And it's something that you kind of have to, what's the word I'm looking for? It's kind of something that you have to navigate through because it does happen quite often. And you then have to either kind of rejig your menu, or sometimes, unfortunately, you just have to wear, the change in price because it's not in every instance that, for example, if potato pricing goes up, we are then able to also put our prices up. Sometimes you just kind of have to stick it through and hope that the prices will come back down.
Yeesh. Potatoes are a staple in Zim, aren't they?
Yes.
So talk to me about that era. How were people coping? Because I can imagine corn, potatoes, wheat. These are some of the staples of the nation. This
Yeah.
doesn't just affect the restauranting industry; it affects everyone at whole.
Yeah.
Talk to me what the context was like in and during that season.
Um, Really, really tough to be honest, because even maize production was down as well, and so maize being, I think, like, ugali or pap, is a staple here broadly, and when those production numbers are low, it kind of starts to create crises, especially in sort of a lot of the rural areas, not only here, but I'm quite certain regionally as well. And once you kind of get food scarcity, it then starts to have a knock-on effect on everything else as well, because people are sort of either scrambling or moving to other food sources, which are quite expensive. And yeah, like it was honestly just a really tough time, especially for us in the food industry. Like I said, it's not every day or in every instance that you're able to put up your pricing to continue to have it make sense. And sometimes you kind of have to weather those tough times in the hopes that it'll get better. I think that part of it is also very tricky because you don't know for certain that next season will be
Mm.
better. And so, you end up kind of having a year that's not so profitable. But you kind of push through it again in the hopes that, this year and the rains were a little bit better, that, things will kind of improve. So it was very, very tough.
Talk to me about strategies around the climate's volatility. I mean, vertical farming, partnering with regenerative farms. What are some of the strategies that you've seen implemented in the southern region of the African continent?
So a lot of it has been building good relationships with your producers. Because, so like for myself, for example, I've kind of taken a shift of going direct to smaller scale producers rather than going through a third party. So that's saying, rather than working with a retailer, for example, it's actually working with the farmers directly. It gives you control over the quality of the produce that you get. And I found that it also gives you a lot more consistency if you work with maybe 3 or 4 producers, because because they're producing at a smaller scale, they also have more control. When you work with, bigger retailers, you kind of respectfully, I think you kind of just become another number, which then makes it difficult in the business context and even in terms of being able to strategize or control any of it. Because if they don't have green paper, they don't have it. And there's nothing you can do about that. But when you work with a producer, you can say, hey, listen, in October, I'm going to need, green pepper. I'm going to need avocado, for example, maybe some fruit or whatever it is. And you can kind of work around making sure that those things are either grown or sourced properly, which then helps you have consistent supply, especially for your menus. For us, for example, with Black Bean, we use a lot of avocado and we need supply all year round. Guacamole, we do an avocado salsa, a bunch of things. And that specifically has been one of the hardest things to source. But again, specifically, that's then something that we've gone and worked with 3 or 4 different producers who are able to supply us year round. So we know that we've always got consistent supply, always having those conversations to make sure that at any given time we're able to supply because, Shayla doesn't care if TJ can't find avocado, she still wants guacamole. So yeah. So those are kind of some of the things. And I found, especially with the fine dining restaurants, especially, you have a lot of restaurants that will go, farm to table. And whether it's working with one farmer specifically, or again, a couple of farmers, they will get everything and have their deliveries done every day from those farms. And based on what is available at the farm, that is what they then use to produce in the restaurant for the day.
Sure. That's really interesting, because then I am thinking of the forecasting of menus. Like, how
Right.
far into the years do you need to forecast? Because you spoke of procuring avocados in a later stage. That
Yeah.
means you would have planned your menus way ahead of time. And
Yeah.
so, if we're looking at the trajectory, the course of planning, for what time frame do you plan in order to firstly make sure that you have what you need, but
Yeah.
also to sort of gauge market and see whether you need to outsource alternatives for what it is you want to offer?
Yeah. So I'd probably say there's a 3 to 6 month lead time on the menus that are finally seen by a consumer, where, like us as chefs in the background, we do a lot of research. There's a lot of R&D, right? So like research and development, whether that's testing flavors or even, the provenance or the sustainability of supply of something, because it's all good and well, for example, to want to do a Norwegian salmon dish, but how much Norwegian salmon can you get? Can you actually serve it on the menu every single day? Is it going to be fresh? Is it going to be frozen? What is the consistency of that supply? Because you might also have someone who's able to supply for a month, and then a month after that, they're not. So I would say usually that time is between 3 and 6 months, depending on the dish, depending on your price point, depending on sort of, I think, what you are trying to achieve with your dish. Just to kind of sort of, I think, rope strategy back into that. Generally, we will try to use produce that is local because it's easier to find and that supply is a lot more sustainable. Again, Norwegian salmon being an example, although it's great, because it has to be, shipped or flown in from Norway, that then can create a bottleneck if you then put it on your menu and something happens to that supply chain. And some of those things sometimes aren't even necessarily climate issues. It's sometimes just logistics issues, right? Flights can be delayed, flights can be backlogged, something can happen, at the processing in Norway that ultimately then affects your restaurant in Joburg, or Dar es Salaam, for example. So it then makes more sense to maybe work with produce that you were able to find in your own context. And then if it is something that's foreign, it's maybe then saying, look, am I able to get salmon from South Africa? It's a little bit closer. There's less likely to be any hindrances, as there may be seafood that we can get from Mozambique that, we're then able to use, and in kind of that way control some of those factors so that you don't then have hindrances later on.
I think I want to now explore, and I suppose this is during critical times. Do diners care how these ingredients are farmed? So, and I'm asking this because you find yourself in a critical time. You're looking for avocados.
Yeah.
There is a gentleman who uses GMO practices in order to harvest his avocados. Do you care? Do you not? What is the integrity at this particular stage where we are in crisis and we cannot access avocados as we would normally?
I think so. I think I found, I'd probably say in the last 2 or 3 years, the consumer's a lot more conscious about not only provenance but farming practices. And historically, farming was just by any means necessary. Whether those things were environmentally good, whether the workers on those farms had good conditions, people didn't really care. And now more so, farmers are not farmers, sorry, both farmers actually and the consumer are very conscious about those things. And so for us as let me call us value adders as chefs, that is something that we have then had to be mindful of as well, in terms of, the farms that we source things from, what is happening on those farms. Do the workers have good conditions? Are the things being produced in ways that are environmentally sustainable? And then even for us as chefs, in our restaurants, there's a lot of movement towards greener practices and practices that are more environmentally friendly. A lot of the takeaway businesses now using either easily recyclable packaging or packaging that's used or produced from recycled materials. Like we partner with a company called Sustainable Africa here in Zim that uses recycled materials to produce all of their packaging. So everything that we use is 100% sustainable in terms of our packaging. And customers are very, very conscious about that. And people will ask you questions. They will say, how is this sourced? Is this stuff recyclable? Have you thought about this? Why are you not working towards more sustainability? Why are you not doing things that are more environmentally conscious? So I think even in not only a regional, but I think in a global context, we've seen a shift go from production by any means necessary to you need to have a conscience about how you produce and how you conduct whatever part of the business or supply chain you are in.
Let's talk about the supply chain resilience.
Yeah.
I am thinking we are in an era where AI is highly integrated into very many workspaces.
Yeah.
I want to know how AI and I suppose developments in technology have affected the resilience of the supply chain. And I'm saying this to the effect of possibly creating a vacuum system that would regenerate Norwegian salmon. Who knows? I mean, this is just me thinking out loud. Okay, can we do that? Is it plausible at this stage?
So I think I'll speak on because I'm more versed, I would say, in kind of how AI is working in farming specifically, and basically between AI and machine learning, what they're doing is using AI to have, again, more, I think, efficient farming practices as well as more sustainable farming practices, right? So previously, you'd have to have years and years and years and years of experience in farming in order to be able to produce a high level product, right? And what AI is able to do is to narrow that where the learning is more succinct, but it's not only what Shayla or TJ have learned, but it's learning across the board for anyone who might be farming in your province or region. And then saying, okay, how do we do that so that we can produce a better high quality crop that affects the environment less and that is also economically more sustainable for us. So it's a much less expensive production process. That's what, in terms of what I'm aware of, that's only one of the ways. I think as we continue to sort of go forward and learn and understand more about AI and how we can use it, I think what it will do is create systems, that are able or that will allow us to produce not only all year round, but a much more efficient production process, right? So a lot less human handling, which means less margin for error, which ultimately then means that we have better produce all the time. Because sometimes, the downturn, I suppose, in production isn't always necessarily environmental. Sometimes it's just human error, right? When I think it was maybe 2 years ago, there was a big outbreak of avian flu in the Southern African region, right? So South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique, which resulted in entire flocks of birds, not only for meat consumption, but for eggs as well, being slaughtered, and that's a biosecurity issue, right? So that's got nothing to do with the weather or anything else. That's just, the farmers on their farms not using the right practices, introducing disease into those places, and then the disease is spreading. And I think being able to use things like machine learning and AI will help us circumvent or reduce and mitigate some of those things going forward.
And what of the application of technology in your menu engineering? I mean, we spoke about farming, right, and how they've integrated technology. Are you also making the best use of technology as it stands?
For me personally, and my colleagues, I would say no. The technology that we've sort of used, I think, is more things like, the equipment that we use in the kitchen. So something like a Thermomix, which is a blender, it's a steam cooker. There are machines and things, and tools or utensils that we've used to make either our cooking processes easier or to make them more precise. But in terms of menu production or menu design, I think that's the chef part of it. It's your creativity and how you kind of put things together. So I would argue that similar to writers, for example, who are concerned about AI taking their jobs, by writing scripts or books for them, I think we are equally worried that someone's just going to go to AI and be like, hey, please, can you do this menu for me? I don't need to hire TJ anymore.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah.
Let's talk about financial planning. Now, the reality is that we can have all these technological advancements help us navigate tough terrain. However, we also have to have budgets that speak to the plausibility of a crisis. So a
Yeah.
buffer budget, if you will. Do you
Yeah.
think this is important for restaurateurs? And how do you then conceptualize that context when you're looking at your offering?
Absolutely. So like I said before, budget is a big part of it, and especially, in bad seasons or where sourcing might be difficult, and sometimes pricing just goes up. For whatever reason, it may be, there's an oil shortage in the world, so fuel price goes up, and because fuel price goes up, although you have the produce, the pricing of that produce increases slightly, right? The difficult position that we find ourselves in, especially in the restaurant business, is that you cannot always pass that burden on to your customer, right? And I'll make it as simple as you can imagine if a KFC or a McDonald's increased their prices every time potatoes were in shortage or every time chicken was in shortage. It would drastically affect their business. So sometimes we have to just wear those fluctuations in price. And essentially what you do is leave yourself a buffer in terms of your margin when you cost. So just to make sure that, because generally your pricing will only ever shift by a couple of cents, not necessarily, a dollar or $2. So because of that, you need to leave yourself enough of a buffer where even if the price fluctuates, it's not going to affect or cripple your business. And you'll find that in situations where restaurants or food businesses don't have that big of a margin, that's generally when they tend to shut down, especially smaller businesses, because they don't have budget for it. So a lot of the startups, a lot of, the food trucks, if anything changes and that pricing model hasn't been done correctly, they will shut down because they just won't have the budget for it, and broadly in the African context, I think it's not every country or every context where you can find financing, which is how you kind of weather some of those storms, right? So you're able to walk into a bank, say, hey guys, listen, I need runway, let's say for the next 3 months. It's been kind of a tough season or a tough go for us. Business has been low. And that's how you sort of weather that storm. I think it then becomes really difficult when you don't have that bank. When you don't have somewhere where you can go and kind of get that assistance. And as I alluded to before, it's why you tend to find that a lot of businesses, although they are good, although they might have good models, may not be able to weather that storm simply just because they don't have enough money. And I think that's something, that for me, I would say is a really, really important thing. And I think there is space for that, especially for financial service providers to assist food businesses in those spaces, because who do you turn to, right? You may not have an auntie or an uncle who's able to say, hey, listen, here's some change, go and get it. You may not have, like I'm saying, there are certain institutions, like I know here in Zimbabwe, it's very difficult to get financing, especially as a small business. And that then makes it difficult to operate in any context, where if you look in other regions and even in the first world, that is the thing that helps them weather that storm. So I think it's a concern for all chefs, and I think for all people in the food industry. And I think it's something, as much as we can, we do try and collaborate. Like I know with a lot of our suppliers, and even with some of my colleagues in South Africa, because we have good relationships with our suppliers, it's not necessarily to say that, every invoice is due when it's due. We're able to have that conversation and say, look, could you give me a little bit of extra time while I try and put the money together? And what's more important is then maintaining the relationship rather than it purely being about the money.
Sure.
Yeah.
Another issue that I've noticed, food wastage in restaurants.
Yeah.
You will see, and what's interesting is that when we think of food wastage, I don't think we account for the meals people didn't finish eating.
Yeah.
Because that's also another factor, right? You can't
Wastage,
serve somebody else's meal,
Yeah.
right? And so how do we mitigate creatively around that? What can we do to ensure that even though a plate of food might have gone to waste because client decides, okay, I'm just going to have a spoon and I'm done with it.
Yeah.
How do we, I don't want to say recycle, because perhaps recycling is not the way forward. How do we use that to firstly feed our crops if you do have any on site? How do we repurpose that for the betterment of that plate of food and you're not wasting? I'm trying to think creatively, and I keep on getting stuck at this question, if I'm to be honest. So I'm like, that's my plate of food. I'm not going to give John my plate of food. That's weird. So what do you do with it?
Yeah. So a big thing, so I'll start at the beginning in terms of when we actually cook, right? So part of it is making sure that the produce that you select, so it's very difficult to, argument's sake, have one particular item for one item on the menu, right? So for example, it's highly unlikely that you would have mangoes and just have one mango dish and it's only used in one place. Because essentially what it means is that if I order 30 kgs of mangoes this week and nobody buys them, they're going to rot, go to waste, and that's a loss for the restaurant, right? So creatively, what we tend to do is through the dishes that we'd have on a set menu is that your ingredients or your supply list works across multiple dishes. That way you're always able to use the things that come in, and it helps to mitigate the waste. That's the first part of it. And in terms of menu design, when we then come to preparation, it's actually part of chef's training in terms of how you trim meat, how you trim vegetables to not have waste. So you want to use as much of, even if it's a potato, if you can use the potato peel, you want to use the potato peel, right? But while you're peeling the potato, you also don't want to be cutting half of your potato into the potato peel, right? Because again, that creates losses because you paid for your potato, if we want to use that example. So you want to make sure that your peeling is done well. That is something that we actually train when we go to school. And then also, even when we're in the kitchen, in terms of the business of the restaurant, we want to make sure that as much of the produce that we've bought actually ends up on, Shayla's plate instead of in the bin. Right. Once you finish preparation, obviously we've served you. We have waste that comes from the kitchen. And like I said, we try and mitigate that through our training and our practices as chefs. And then we have the waste that's going to come out of the restaurant right? Like you said, maybe you only have half of your food, you throw that away. Maybe you just didn't like the food, maybe it wasn't prepared to the standard that you wanted, etc. Obviously, you're trying to avoid those things, but it does happen. And so we have all of the waste that then comes out of the restaurant. And in terms of waste management, I'll come back to sustainability and being conscious about your practices through the restaurant. And that's something increasingly that I think a lot of restaurants are doing. There are companies that can do biodigesters for you where all of the waste that comes out of the restaurant goes into a biodigester, which then creates gas that you can use for your cooking. Other restaurants will take all of that waste and actually give it back to the farmers that they work with so the farmers can create compost, which helps fertilize sustainably rather than artificial or synthetic fertilizers. So there are a bunch of different, I would say, angles of viewpoints that, not only food businesses, but the restaurant industry in general actually use in order to combat some of those things, because waste is not only bad for the environment, it's bad for business, right? So if I am buying a fillet steak, argument's sake, and of 1 kg that we buy, we only actually end up serving 500 grams. It means that there's 500 grams of meat that I'm paying for that's just going to waste, right? Which is bad for business. So we try and make sure that, of that, yes, we need to trim and so on, but we're trying to say of that 1 kg, maybe 900 grams actually goes where it's supposed to go. And that's true for meats, for vegetables, for everything else, as well as, like I'd even mentioned before, for packaging. I think increasingly people in the restaurant industry, and especially chefs, are more conscious about that and leaving as little a footprint in terms of waste and waste management as possible.
Let's talk about advocacy. So there's a school of thought that suggests that chefs are storytellers, which is factual, and they do this through food. Is it possible, plausible, tangible for chefs to tell stories by elevating indigenous, climate-resilient crops such as sorghum, your millet, your bambara, in order to conscientize the consumer, firstly, with respect to the realities of climate change, but also to conscientize them for themselves, right? So if Shayla is cognizant of the fact that Black Bean Takeria is doing XYZ, she can begin to implement this in her own home. She can begin to save as opposed to be, I suppose, nonchalant about wasted food. And so do you think that's a possibility? Do you think people want to hear that story? Like, I'm just trying to have a decent meal, and you're telling me about climate change. It's a real
Why
question.
are you telling me about this? So in two parts, I think yes, people do want to hear about it, and it actually happens all the time. Right. There are chefs across the world, like one of, maybe not necessarily a mentor, but one of the chefs I follow, Alex Atala, who's a Brazilian chef. He trained in Europe. After training in Europe, went back to Brazil to make indigenous Brazilian food. And he's now a big advocate for preserving not only the rainforests, but the cultures of the indigenous communities in Brazil. And he does all of that work through his restaurant, And so, and people love that, right? And again, I think as long as you're able to tell the story well, and I'm not, shoving it down your throat, right? So it's like, hey, buy a burrito, you need to change the climate. No, right? But if you're able to do it in a way that is genuine and in a way that connects with your particular customer base, I think I actually think us as chefs, I think we have a duty to do those things and kind of be active in whatever space it might be. You know, again, like I said, whether it's advocating for good working conditions on farms, whether it's advocating for sustainable farming practices, whether it's advocating for sustainable restaurant practices. You know, I don't think those things are somebody else's job, you know, and in a broad context, I think we all have a role to play in everything that we do in order to make sure that we maintain and look after the world that we live in, because we all live in it, you know, and trying to shirk that responsibility, I think, is difficult, because if not you, then who, right? If you're leaving it to someone else to do it and they leave it to someone else, nothing's ever going to get done, you know. So I actually think, you know, for us as chefs, I think we have a duty. And like I said, around the globe, there are people who have led in showing that you can advocate through food and through what you do in your restaurant. And I personally think it's a really important thing to do.
And lastly, Chef, as we close off the conversation, I want to find out from you what excites you about this new era. I know a lot of people are going to focus on the doom and gloom. So I want us to end off on a really, I suppose, upbeat step, if you will. Just to say that, listen, the future is brighter because we'll make it brighter. What excites you?
I think what excites me the most, and what is interesting to me, is that, especially in an African context, is that we are moving closer to how we historically used to do things, right? So historically, all of our farming practices and our production practices were symbiotic with nature, with our surroundings, right? In our tribes, in our villages, the way that we ate meat, the way that we foraged for vegetables, even when we started farming, the way that we produced crops, all of those things were done in ways that were in sync with our environment and with the world around us. And as we've moved away from, again, production for the sake of it, interestingly, we're starting to move back to how we used to do things as Africans in the beginning. And I find that not only fascinating, but really exciting, because I think it puts us back in touch with our history and puts us back in touch with the continent and more in line with who we are as Africans and as people. And in that way, also makes sure that we are able to leave a continent behind that is better for the future generations than what we found it when we came into it.
Chef, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Stella, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure.
The voice there of Chef TJ, who is of Harare's Black Bean Tekeria, just helping us understand how chefs are maximizing in the state that we find ourselves in. If climate change was a complaint you personally had, you're saying, Shayla, listen, let's preserve the environment. Let's make sure that we are maximizing on waste management. Let us use greener products, healthier products. We shifted the tilt toward the restauranting industry, and we looked at the realities that chefs and restaurateurs go through when it comes to climate change, and he helped us navigate that conversation ever so beautifully. It is 11 p.m. Central African time. If you have just joined us, hello, how are you? Welcome to African Diaries. Shayla and Dikumana keeping you company. In the hour that is to come, we are going to learn how to fall in love. The theme for this week's Hot 6 Love Songs is how music can make you fall in love.
Africa's very own think tank. This is Channel Africa Online. www.channelafrica.co.za.